some of our data collection and data parsing systems. So yeah, Jack unfortunately couldn't make it today. He I guess missed a calendar invite and he's on his way to the airport right now. But obviously Michael and I are here and Kwang's here. Yeah, so we've got a couple of updates for you. I'll just start with introduce myself to Chris. I'm Jack. This is the project was an idea I kind of had and got some momentum behind from some other people in the program. All we're looking to do essentially is develop an algorithmic trading strategy of sports gambling positions. And it's been a really interesting research so far because there's very little out about it. But we got really lucky with one thing, and this is kind of our major update. We found an odds maker at Fanduel. He's actually based in Ireland with, I think it was Paddy Power Betfair was the company before they were acquired by Fanduel. And his title is, my understanding is essentially he's the equivalent of a senior trader. He's doing some kind of, he's managing odds makers specifically on their risk side. So making sure that they're not taking way too crazy positions kind of thing is kind of what we picked up from it. And he's been really helpful for us. We've bounced a couple of questions off of him and he's given us some ideas for how to go forward with this, with what we're doing. Specifically some ideas with how the markets are structured more so than we knew. So the first thing that he said to us when we were explaining this, he's like, okay, obviously we're focused in prop betting markets, but he said it's important to understand that every prop betting market is a derivative market of the spread market or the over-under market. So he made a couple of suggestions for us in our predictive systems to tie all that into what the market's predicting in the overall game. So for instance, if we were predicting point scoring for a specific player in basketball, instead of predicting it based on the hard number as what I had shown last time we met, he said, if you're trying to cut down your error, you should try and predict it based on, take the time series as a percentage of points scored, predict based on that, and then you would multiply that percentage by what the over-under prediction is for the game. So your prediction is going to be more likely to score within what the market is seeing as what the correct score would be. And now instead of predicting the hard number, you're predicting the percentage of output. Was one suggestion he had. He had a few others. I have some notes, but he's been really helpful and he's encouraged us to come back to talk to him as we develop more things. So yeah, that's kind of what we have with that.
Very interesting, man. Is this someone that you said you made contact with through the school or university?
So there's a Lehigh alum at Fanduel. She graduated, I think, 2 years ago. I reached out to her and I was just like, oh, I'm interested in this. Like, is there anyone that you know of that I can talk to? And she's like, I know the perfect person, and put me in touch with this guy. And he's been really helpful. He's talked to us a few times, and I've talked with a couple of other people at different sports books. He's definitely been the most helpful, but they're a lot more willing to talk about what they do and how they do it than we had originally thought. I mean, they're not going to say, oh, this is how we price something, but they'll say like, our systems generally use this. Like, that's kind of like, he can't tell us the inputs obviously, but like he can tell us the modeling idea of how they're pricing and how they're going about this. And yeah, no, it was definitely very interesting to learn for sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm very new to this side of, analytics, I guess. I did, just to, I guess, introduce myself, I did some, data analysis in the ticket industry, in the reselling ticket industry. So didn't do much modeling, interested in seeing kind of how that, that is constructed. And I'm curious to hear about how you guys have gone about, taking what you've learned from these people you've been talking to and putting it to work. So
yeah,
thanks for having me, by the way. Appreciate it.
It's nice to meet you, Chris. I'm Michael. I'm part of the team as well. I guess to fill you in just on our basic strategies that we've come up with, we really have two. One is just a basic juice spread that we're looking for, where two different books are offering the same bet, the same prop at plus odds on both sides. So no matter the outcome,
essentially it's like a box spread in options trading. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Michael.
Yeah, no problem. And then the other one, which is a little bit more unique, is what's called a middling option, or a middling. In the gambling industry, they call it middling, which is where you basically have two separate books that have different lines for a game. So one book may predict a player to score 19.5 points, and the other book may predict the player to score 16.5 points. And so we're bracketing that in so that one side will take the under on the higher line, the over on the lower line. So one of those will always win, but we have that window of opportunity in the middle where if both of them hit, it's like almost a 200% return on investment there. And so we have that idea, and now what we're working to do is really come up with probability distributions to determine what the actual chances are that that window will hit, so that we know if it'll have a positive EV, to determine which of those opportunities are worth taking and which aren't.
So
sorry, I was just going to say, we've done some manual testing. We're making it automated, but we're essentially trying to build a portfolio of those options. And there's enough of them out there where we can get maybe 10 to 20 options a night that are potentially worth taking.
Very cool. So when you mentioned earlier, you're basically hedging through multiple odds and kind of giving yourself a percentage chance of how likely, both of those are to hit, or at least one of them to hit. Am I seeing that correctly, or what else goes into it? I guess I was just a little bit.
I mean, that's definitely like how it works. Now the question becomes like, how do the individual parts of it work? So like you said, we're basically comboing spreads. They're mimicking option trading strategies. So pricing it isn't that hard. It's basically like, in this case, because it's binary in nature, it either hits or it doesn't. You just have to derive the probability of something hitting or not. In the juiced case, that probability of it hitting is 1, so it's very easy to understand. The middling case is a little bit more complicated. That's kind of where we were talking with this Fanduel trader to get an idea of like, how do we predict this kind of thing? And we gave him an idea of like what we were doing, and essentially what it was is a time series analysis type approach, which he said you definitely could be on the right track. You just need to make sure that you're pricing this. You're not just like, it's not just take the data, fit a time series model to it and predict. Like you have to, like I was saying earlier, like you have to look at it as like, okay, what's the percentage of total points scored? Because that's going to be a better predicting system, because then it takes out the element of predicting the game outcome. You're only predicting, his production relative to the score of the game.
You're basically taking advantage of odds makers who have already done the work for you, I guess, in terms of just like what that possible, what the most likely outcome is for that game.
And that's where he's a great resource, is because he can explain like, okay, these are the ones that like we know that they're going to have right. Like if you look at, to give you like the intuitive evidence, if you look at over-unders, or if you look at point spreads for NBA games, I can guarantee you they're all going to be within 1 point of each other. That's because it's, as he put it, it's all run through Vegas. They have their system. No one's going to move based off that, because that's where the market's hurting to. And also, if the market's hurting to it, that probably means they have something in the background that's telling them that's what it's going to be. So, yeah.
Which is
Perfect.
where we
appreciate that explanation.
Mm-hmm. And to bounce off that, we're looking at prop bets in particular because they're a more niche market, and so their process is less refined for how they're getting those lines, and so books are a little bit different amongst each other. So that's where we feel like we can find the most opportunity, and it's because it's niche. it's a very, very small percent of their business. So they're not looking to make that their main focus as well. It really is like, especially with sports betting being so new and kind of novice for so many, we feel like there's an opportunity specifically within those prop bets.
That makes a lot of sense. Emerging market, there's going to be more opportunity because they don't have as much experience, I guess, creating the market, knowing what they're doing.
Yep.
Years
Exactly.
of, yeah, makes sense.
Yep. And the other interesting thing is with that market, as opposed to like say a full game market, they're going to put a lot of time and effort into, obviously, because that's where most of the volume is, but also because it's easier, as they put it, it's not as difficult to predict an individual prop from their perspective. They can do their simulations and whatever to get their game prediction. The props, though, they're all, because they all have their own system to predict the game. A prop market's a derivative of the game market. So because their systems are all different, their systems are all going to make a different prediction on the individual prop, or not necessarily the same prediction, which is kind of why it spreads out. And the other thing is there's less hurting of them in those markets because, they all think that they're right. And oftentimes one is and everyone else isn't, kind of thing. So that's kind of where we're trying to take advantage. But I guess that's where we become unique in that we're not trying to say we're right and all of them are wrong. We're just trying to get two of them to argue, and then we take advantage of it.
Yeah, in fact, the idea kind of stemmed off the fact that the books are so good at what they do. They're incredibly accurate. It's pretty crazy how often games finish like right on the over/under line or the point spread line. So the concept was, if two books are different in what their predictive number is going to be, the true predictive number very likely is probably within those numbers. So that was kind of what the idea stemmed from.
Mm-hmm.
So you're kind of giving yourself that little bit of, yeah, you're squeezing yourself in between the sports books that are both, kind of hedged there or put their bets on a certain line, and you're kind of like, hey, well, they're probably right, one of them at least. So
Right.
If we can get somewhere in between there, and have you found that there's a higher likelihood of hitting already from your analysis by doing that yet? Is there like a higher likelihood of you hitting on those predictions if you go in between two sports books, and like which sports books do you look at? Are you looking at the Vegas odds? How does that work?
Michael, you want to talk about the empiricals, and then I can talk about the
yeah. So when we came up with the idea before we built it in like to do it automatically, I just kind of went through over 3 weeks, and I basically I would check throughout the day to see what new lines were coming out to basically find those opportunities. This was looking at NBA data specifically, and like I was saying, I was finding like 20 to 40 opportunities a day, and putting equal weight on every opportunity, which is something that we want to look into, putting more weight on the better opportunities.
On certain ones.
Right, but to start off, I just did I did equal opportunity on every single one, and I think like maybe 90% of those days that I went through, we had a positive EV or a positive result from those days, meaning that we hit on enough to cover all the misses, and some of them were significant profits as opposed to just kind of covering. So that was when we kind of decided, hey, like this is like a potentially really good opportunity once we figure out what the actual percentages are, so for each opportunity, so that we can determine like which of these opportunities we shouldn't have taken. But
yeah,
the point.
So you're going to look over time, like the more I guess the more you do, you look at these odds and you see, okay, 90% of the days we hit enough. What certain things were we hitting on? And then being able to apply that to future bets. Like, I guess, is it kind of coming up with a score somehow for each odd on the day? Like, okay, this has a 75% chance of hitting, but this odd has a 25%. Because you were saying that you kind of gave equal weight to it, but you're looking into whether you might be able to kind of give more weight to certain bets going forward.
Well, that's kind of where it becomes more of an optimization problem than anything. There's a couple ways you could go about that. Well, one of the ways we were considering, and this is a little bit further down the line, I think, but we had an idea of, okay, let's price everything, right? Let's take our, our predictive system such that we have our probability of a hit versus a miss, get the expected value of it, and then say, all right, if I want to maximize the expected value subject to whatever constraint, and then see what we can come up with based on that. That's like, that would be I guess the ideal-ish way to go about it. And, the objective function and constraints can obviously change to be easier to solve. What becomes more of an issue is that these positions present themselves over time. So you have to consider, okay, like we've priced the probability of this hitting to, be whatever percentage, right? In past, we've seen, that these hit however often, or we could just ignore the in past we've seen this hits however often and just say, we think our probability values are right, and go with it from there. Like, I guess the best way to compare it to, it's like, there's an example of lottery players in Massachusetts that figured out this. It was called cash windfall or something. And what they figured out is there was a positive EV on the ticket on certain days. It's a similar concept to that, where essentially we just, instead of saying like, how are we going to weight this or whatever, we just need to like say, this has a positive EV, we should give it this much more weight versus whatever else. I guess is kind of how to look at that. But that's a little bit further down the road. So yeah.
I'm going to be skeptical if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Which is obviously, so it sounds like, first of all, well done to Michael for sort of articulating very clearly. There's two types of opportunities you're looking for. There's the one, and forgive me for not knowing the betting language, but there's the second one where you've got like sort of, you're looking for something to come in the middle. If it comes in the middle, you make big. If it goes on the edges, one of them, you lose a little, basically, I think was the second one. And the first one you explain is if the same line is being mispriced. If there's like a mispricing that because they're different in their price, you can take one side at one side or the other, and there's an arbitrage to be made there. So you being able to articulate what you're trying to do with your model, that is 101 of research management. So have a very clear statement of, we are trying to predict this to do that, and be able to articulate it very clearly so that everyone on the team understands. That's sometimes objective number one. It's harder than it sounds. Next thing is, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? So obviously the outputs are place a bet of X. The question is, what are the inputs? So what is the data you're using for an input? And you spoke a lot about EV, expected value, and so on. But what is the actual data that you're using for that?
Gotcha.
Is that still TBD?
So we actually made a couple of breakthroughs with that. So first, we need to consider the underlying data, because you can't price a derivative without understanding the underlying asset. So in this case, what we found an open source library in Python that scrapes specific sports statistics sites, which we've been using. It's been pretty effective so far. It's been nice because it's a little bit less on our end of actually coding how to do this, and more of okay, we can actually look at data. So we need to consider the underlying data. The next thing we need to consider is the actual positions as they exist. So that's something that Quang's been working on with Jack. Obviously, we have a scraper right now that runs through a site and gets positions at any given time. Now what they're trying to do is parse through that, so that way they only see those specific spreads that we're saying we're looking for. So it cuts anything out. The goal is to cut anything out that's not a juice or a middle spread.
So just to be clear, the only input data you're using is the pricing or the lines that you can see.
Where the lines and the underlying performance data. Now the question is,
what is the underlying, as in what is the outcome of the game going to be?
As in, like, what's LeBron James stat lines look like for the last 50 games?
Fine. So it's basically a time series of historical performance. You
Correct.
don't know what LeBron James will do tomorrow, but you do know what he's done historically.
Correct.
Okay.
So
what is the key assumption? So the key assumption presumably is
yesterday predicts tomorrow.
Yeah. There's no surprises. There's more continuity and less surprises. Then you don't expect upsets.
So that's kind of what, like, we had an extensive conversation with Raymond about this. He's the guy at Fanduel. And what he said was they price everything on simulation based on historical data. So they're running, he explained running a Monte Carlo simulation on the game. Their inputs are all based on historical stuff. Once they come up with whatever they have, then they put it out there and they read what the market's saying and they adjust based on that.
Got it. So there's a view of fair value, and then it's a market derived price based on how counterparties interact with it.
Right. So what we had said was, we're going to fit a time series to the production and see what happens. Because if you look at these time series, they actually are like statistically significantly stationary. So they're easier to work with. I
can believe that. I mean, not knowing much about sports, but trying to predict the percentage of points LeBron James in the team's score is an easier game than trying to predict what his absolute score is going to be. That makes it.
Well, I mean, his absolute score itself is statistically speaking stationary. I actually just did some analysis on this for a class. But what he said was, you don't want to just do based on the total production. You should do it based on the percentage of the total production. That's going to be easier to predict. And also it's going to be better because then there's less risk associated with your prediction. Because now, instead of saying I need to predict his total production, it's just I need to predict his relative production, and I'm letting the market predict what the total production should be.
So question then, if you predict, so this inputs, outputs, what is the data you're using to model? What is the output of the model? What are you going to use it for? It sounds like the betting you want to do with these two middling inducing, forgive my language, I have no idea what they but you're predicting then the relative points.
Right.
So do you have to hedge out the team score somewhere? So if you've got LeBron James going to score 80% of the team score, that's great to know that. But then how does that get translated into, presumably the bet is on how many points he scores. The bet is not on 80%.
Okay, so I get that. So the two markets that drive every other sports gambling market are the over under, which is the total points scored in the game, and the point spread, which is the difference between the score of the two teams. So if you divide that's the over under by 2, and you divide the point spread by 2, adding or subtracting, you should be able to figure out the prediction of the individual team's score. Right. So then what you would do, what he explained is, and what we're looking into now is, take that prediction of the percentage of total teams of points scored by whichever player, by that, what the market's predicting, and then adjust your distribution accordingly, and you should have a distribution on his points scored. And all you've done is do a percentage of prediction on his production, but it should accomplish the same thing. Okay, essentially.
So what I hear you're saying is there'll be a transformation. You'll predict his relative. There'll be a transformation that will give you the absolute, and then you'll place a bet on the absolute. Because that's very different from what I thought you were going to say, which is you'll hedge out the absolute score somehow with some other bet. But it sounds like that's not okay.
That's not exactly what you're saying, but like how exactly, that's a good idea. How exactly would you, like, speaking in like in a conventional financial market sense, how would you do that?
In a conventional financial market sense, I mean, I don't think you do in a sports book. That's why I kind of, it was making me question. In a conventional market, you're buying stocks and you're hedging the underlying market. So basically, you're buying Apple, IBM, you're shorting Coca-Cola and Pepsi or whatever. You know, you're either pairs trading one against the other, or you're hedging out with the futures of the entire market. But I don't think that's, and so forget that point. The question then is, how are you going to translate from a relative score into an absolute score? And if there's a formula to do that, and if you've already got a way to do that, great. If not, that would be a question, which is make sure you don't end up predicting and modeling something that you can't translate into how you're going to place the bets.
Right.
So Michael sort of talked about the bets, and these are the bets, these are the opportunities, and then make sure the thing that you're predicting helps you do that. They're trying to make the link with the processing, the outputs, and what it's going to be used for.
So in my understanding, based on what I've learned with time series analysis, is the transformation is just points over total points. So once I've made my adjusted time series, my understanding is I should be able to make a prediction and then adjust it back using the same. So in this case, it would just be multiplying the over under by the percentage of total points scored prediction should give me my prediction of his points scored. And my understanding is the distribution just adjusts accordingly.
And so the total points scored by the game is going to be market implied, or you're going to try and
market implied.
Okay, fine. That's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
So your prediction is your secret sauce. You're just deriving from the market what the market is implying the total games. Okay.
Correct.
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes
And because specifically in basketball, we can talk about, we need to get a better understanding of other markets too, but specifically in basketball, the over under market and the point spread are almost always correct.
Well, so
and
long as
they're almost always the same.
So that's where the idea started, right? You wanted to have like an accurate basis of data and or market information about the over-unders for every game to be able to kind of like understand how to build a model correctly, I guess. In a newer market, like you were talking about, you guys are doing prop bets too. You're looking at the prop bets. Wouldn't that be like more difficult to predict whether one is going to hit or not? And, versus something that you have all that data on. I know you were saying it's a derivative of it.
Right. I get what you're saying. So I'm trying to think of the best way to answer the question. The reason we're in the prop bets is because there's less liquidity, so there's more alpha. We're just thank you, Ben. We're just using the major